This is what you gave me to read out, isn't it? Yeah, right. Okay. Okay, so we'll start with Sue Swalwell. She's a guild member, as I say, and her curiosity about her family started when, as a child, she and her sister explored the hidden treasures of the attic in the Victorian farmhouse in North Yorkshire where they lived. And it contained all sorts of memorabilia kept by several generations of the family, and her grandfather would regale her with stories about the treasures they found and the people they featured. What a great resource. It was rescuing that attic treasure, including 150 memorial cards from a bonfire, sacrilege, when the family farm was sold, that triggered the research into her ancestry and the communities in which they lived. And that was nearly 40 years ago. Impossible. And that research evolved eventually into the Swalwell One Name Study, which she registered with the Guild in 2012. She loves pursuing and rebuilding the life stories of bearers of the Swalwell name and connecting with new cousins through the DNA project. And having retired from the career in advertising and marketing, she's become a regular speaker at family history events, sharing those stories and her research experience built up over those 40 years. And this is the first time I think we've probably had a double act speakers. So Sue is ably assisted, and I'm not sure even assisted, that takes away from the importance of your part, Marilyn. All right. She's assisted by her expert consultant, Marilyn Standfast. Marilyn, after leaving grammar school, gained an American Field Service scholarship to live in Atlanta, Georgia with an American family and attend high school for a year. Returning, she attended University of London, gaining a history honours degree, specialising in American history and Roman history and archaeology. Following graduation, Marilyn retrained as a traffic engineer, specialising in road safety, and worked for 2 local authorities. In addition, in her spare time, she started researching her family tree, which was complicated by her Jewish and Swedish roots. She's currently researching 2 families who served in the American Civil War. Marilyn also works as a tour manager for a travel company specialising in military tours, and has taken groups to all parts of the world, including Russia, Poland, the United States, and most of Western Europe. For over 20 years, she's run the Sharp Appreciation Society, and that's led to her deep interest in the rifles and Napoleonic Wars. So over to Sue, assisted by Marilyn, to tell us about Matthew Swalwell, a warring weaver.
Thank you, and I apologise in advance if my microphone technique isn't very good. I tend to wave my hands around a lot when I speak. I will try not to. So if you can't hear me at any point, just tell me. But first of all, welcome, and thank you for coming along to hear the story of Matthew today. Or at least the story so far, as there is always more research to do and other questions to answer. The Swalwell One Name Study was started and registered in 2012. And without starting that study, I don't think I genuinely would have found Matthew and had the joy of researching his life, because my ancestors are all farmers, ag labs, and show very little inclination to volunteer for military service or even respond to call-ups. So it's been fabulous, and that's one of the things I love about doing my One Name Study, is actually finding those bearers of the Swalwell surname who have really interesting stories to tell, and often those stories have been forgotten. And that's certainly true of Matthew in terms of his story. So I was very fortunate to find Matthew, but perhaps was even more fortunate to find my 4th cousin, Marilyn Standfast. So a fellow researcher of the Swalwells and now a close friend. Her military expertise has helped me immensely in understanding a world that is completely alien to me, which is the military. And she's brought to life the campaign and battlefield experiences that Matthew would have endured, and she's brought along lots of photographs at the back of the battlefields that she has visited where Matthew fought. From the moment we turned our attention to Matthew, we were of like minds. We didn't want just to find out the facts of his military service. We wanted to try and understand his life story and build up a holistic picture. And of course, that is always difficult, but we wanted to try and understand why he'd pursued a military path. So this is not a talk about the detail of specific records of the Napoleonic Wars, because there are far more expert people than myself to tell you how to access them and how to find them. This is more about how we've used a diverse set of records to build a story around his military career, but also his home career and his home life. So the way we're going to do it today is I'm going to talk about his early life and speculate as to why he might have joined the army in the first place. When we get to him joining the Rifles, I will hand over to Marilyn, who will cover the battlefields and the experience of the Peninsula and the Waterloo. And then I will cover his return home and the story of how he became a Chelsea pensioner and how much we've learnt from that experience of it. In cemeteries all over the world stand stones as a legacy to a life led by an individual. Most of them contain some core data about that person, their date of death, possibly the date of birth, and the names of their loved ones buried alongside them. Usually, though, nothing is revealed about them as a person or the life that they have led. If we look at Matthew's life and take the core vital records of birth, marriage and death, he was baptised at St Mary's Church in Barnard Castle. So the other ambition of today's talk is to actually make Barnard Castle famous for something other than opticians. He was married at Startforth, which actually lies just across the bridge from Barnard Castle, but actually importantly lies in Yorkshire. So he's a fellow Yorkshireman, which I'm particularly proud of. He died and was buried at Herworth. So a sum total of 19 to 20 miles was the radius if you just look at the vital statistics of his life. And even if we include Richmond, Yorkshire, where he appears in the 1851 census, it really doesn't extend his geographical range at all. And you will see just how many miles and many places he did actually travel in his life later. Matthew was the son of William Swalwell and his second wife Elizabeth Kay, and he was baptised on the 25th of May 1787. At the time, the French Revolution was still 2 years away. Napoleon was still an unknown threat in Europe, and the young Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, was apparently considering a career in music as opposed to war. So no one around that font could have anticipated that this infant would become one of a band of men considered to be the best marksmen in Europe and described by the French as the rascals in green. He would become the Swalwell's family very own Sharp, the character made famous by the books of Bernard Cornwell and the subsequent TV series. And that might explain some of my interest in Matthew Swalwell. In fact, his destiny was probably to be a weaver. The family tree represents our current thinking of the relationships that existed between the individuals found in Barnard Castle during the time of Matthew's childhood and before the start of his military adventures. They, like most families, though, actually used the same first names over and over again. So I think I've got my Johns all in the right place, but I don't guarantee it. The aim of this slide is simply to demonstrate that Matthew was born into an established population of Swalwells in Barnard Castle. It was extensive. Okay, they'd only arrived in 1721, or that's the 1721, or that's the earliest record we've found so far. And where that John originated from, there is a lot of debate about, so we haven't resolved that issue yet. But by the time Matthew was baptised, they'd been there for over 60 years. There was an extensive number of cousins, nephews, nieces, etc., all living there. And at the time, it was Barnard Castle was a relatively prosperous place, with much of it being built on its textile industry. At the time of John's marriage, Barnard Castle was known for the production of two things: woolen stockings and leather bridles, and I'm not sure what the connection between the two were. The point of this chart is just to say he had an extensive family, so his requirement, his need to join the army was not based on a lack of family ties in his local area. It may have been to escape those family ties, but it certainly wasn't his primary motivation. He'd been born into a weaving family, as I said, in a weaving town. So the expectations were that he would follow in the footsteps, and he did indeed become a weaver. In the picture at the bottom of the slide, you will see a house with a lot of windows on the top floor, and that is a weaver's house. That top floor was where the looms would have been, and the windows were there to provide more light to the loom and the work that was being done. But if you look at the end of that street, what you'll also see is a factory. And towards the end of the 18th century, when Matthew was entering the trade of a weaver, the factories were becoming more and more numerous in Barnard Castle. The work was changing. Fashions had changed considerably over the century, so woolen stockings were not a requirement very much anymore. And also the fabrics and yarn used had changed. Originally, Barnard Castle was very much a woolen industry. In the early part of Matthew's career, and also subsequently when he returned, it was linen that he was weaving. Prices had fallen, new types of manufacturing had brought the prices down, new materials being imported brought the prices down, and for some reason Barnard Castle decided to produce the weavers of Barnard Castle decided to produce an inferior product, which only exacerbated the problem. So by the time Matthew became a weaver, the conditions of taking up that trade in Barnard Castle was very precarious. And therefore, it's not surprising that he was not the only weaver, because it was happening nationally. He was not the only weaver in Wellington's army, and in fact there were a lot of weavers who joined it. And it was more out of necessity than any desire or patriotic ardour. There was a bounty of 10 guineas, and there was 6p a day pay. There was the promise of possibly a share of plunder and guaranteed food. So perhaps it was just a common sense decision to make. Whether that was Matthew's motivation, we do not know. The other thing to say is that the family were all members of the City of Durham's Guild of Drapers, as it's known now. But originally they joined the Guild of Tailors with the original John. And we believe that original John served an apprenticeship and was allowed to join the guild because of that servitude. But every one of those other people on the chart who became a guild member did it through patrimony, simply because their father was a member, which meant that they could pursue work and things which weren't necessarily part of being drapers and merchants, drapers and tailors. And I'm not going to get into the definition of what the drapers' work was, because even the Guild of Drapers says they can't define it exactly, so I'm not going to try. The reason they might have joined were that there were a number of benefits. They could have a stall free of charge in Durham City. They had right of common on the moor outside the city, and the right to use designated land by the river for grazing animals. And from 1801 had a right to the share in income from property belonging to the freemen. So although it cost them to join, they may have made more out of it than they actually paid. The advantage of this, for me as a family historian, and perhaps the best benefit of all, was their right to vote. So actually all of those people who are actually members of that guild, I've been able to track through the poll books to find out how they're impacted. But not only does it say where they moved to and where their abode was, it actually indicates that Matthew was by no means the only military person in his family. Matthew was 2 when the French stormed the Bastille. He was 5 when France declared war on Holland and Britain. And he was 11 when Napoleon swore by his sword to extirpate the English from off the earth, as shown in this Gilray illustration. So he'd grown up with the, very much with the threat of, no, sorry, I've gone back wrong. He had grown up with the threat of the French. And in 1803, a number of things happened. The continuation of the French war started. The North Yorkshire militia were embodied again. And in Barnard Castle, a rumour spread. that Napoleon had invaded. And in that sense of turmoil, a company of actors called the Social Comedians of the Tees Bank, of the Bank of the Tees, went to the butter market and actually read a poem stirring their people and the population to actually do their duty and the glory of defending their home and family. The London Gazette also announced within 1803 about the fact that the Lord Lieutenant of the county was promising to resist and finally defeat the ambitious and insulting invaders. We don't know whether Matthew heard the poem. We don't know whether that made him feel very patriotic, but he certainly didn't immediately respond because he wouldn't join the militia till he was 20, and that may well have been because he was completing his apprenticeship as a weaver. He wasn't the first to take the military path, as I've said. During the wars with France, in fact, there appears to be a family tradition of service in the militia, with an apparent preference for the North York. The records of the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, show that at least 5 members of the family served long enough to actually, and survived long enough to actually get their pension from the Chelsea, and actually were there for a phenomenal amount of time. And in terms of service, it's over, I think, around 145 years we've calculated that they were serving. I have to admit that I'm not the best person to try and explain the militia. Because at several times I've got very confused about them in terms of the volunteers, the local militia, the supplementary militia, the permanent militia, the regular. There's so many terms going around. So I've turned my attention to the only person that I know of who's written a history of the North York militia, Robert Bell Turton, and used his to try and explain to me what the different ones did. We have to remember that there was a civil and a military purpose to the militia at this time. It was organised on county grounds and in Yorkshire on a riding basis. And basically, my understanding of the difference and how I've made sense of it is actually where these people could be ordered to go to. So the regular army could be ordered abroad, the militia could not. The North York militia served out of county largely, but a local or a permanent local militia raised in 1808 could not be ordered out of the county, and that force was disembodied in 1815. And then you had the supplementary militia, the local guys who came out with their hay forks and promised swords and various things to defend their life. There were certain various levels of training and other conditions under which they served, but that for me seems to be a reasonable explanation of the militia. And that becomes evident when you look at this map, which identifies all the places Robert Bell Turton has identified as where they were linked to during this period of embodiment. The red dots signify their permanent quarters, which were places where they would stay for some considerable time. So they spent 2 years in Suffolk, they spent 2 years in Newcastle, 2 years in Glasgow. So they moved around. They spent several years over the Waterloo period in Ireland. And they did lots of marching, but they also did other things. They operated as prisoner escorts, from taking French prisoners from Portsmouth up to Norman Cross. They worked on prison hulks, and they were called to maintain civil order. In terms of sorry, I've got lost in my slides. So they actually attended seamen riots at Gateshead. They went to miners' strikes and controlled those in Durham. And they continued to be trained and drilled. But they would also help out locally with the harvest. If they'd done all their training and drilling, they would be allowed to go and help the farmers in the field gather their corn. So it was quite a varied life in that context. A fellow North York man and a rifleman, Sir John Kincaid, in his book Random Shots from a Rifleman, is very complimentary about the North York. He's a guy who actually managed to recruit in a day from the North York militia enough recruits to earn a commission. It is said by Robert Belturton that of all those that he recruited that day, only 3 would actually return to tell the tale of the Peninsula and Waterloo, and one of those was Kincaid. So finally, and I don't think he was recruited by Kincaid, sadly, because that would be part of a beautiful tale, on the 1st of April 1809, Matthew enlisted in the 95th Rifles, 1st Battalion, and I will now let Marilyn pick up on Matthew's tale from here.
Thanks, Sue. Before I get actually into Matthew, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background to the British Army at the time. Regiments generally consisted of 2 battalions, and the 95th Rifles had 2, but was increased to 3. The 1st battalions should have 1,000 men divided into 10 companies of 100 men, but the average was 60. And generally composed of the more experienced soldiers. The 2nd Battalion, as it's put, were composed of less effective men. 700 to 900 would be the maximum in that battalion. Each was commanded by a lieutenant colonel and each company by a captain. When all 10 companies of a regiment were in line, the grenadiers were on the right and the light companies on the left. Typically, in the Peninsula, the British infantry of 10 companies, when going into battle, formed 2 lines, the thin red line, as it came to be known. The French fought in column. The Guards regiments considered to be an elite regiment, and the cavalry the most flamboyant. Generally, all officers bought their commissions in the army. The humiliation of the British regular army in the American War of Independence, you may recall we lost the colonies, resulted in tactical and organisational changes in the army structure. Regimental light companies were formed, but the quality of the British skirmishers, except for the rifle regiments, was well below that of the French. The Light Division was formed in 1810 and consisted of the 95th Rifles, the 43rd, the 52nd, the Royal American Rifles, and the Portuguese Caçadores. And the Light Division was one of the best in Europe. The only problem is in many of the sources, when trying to find out about individuals, they use the terms rifles or light division haphazardly. Consequently, you're never quite sure whether your particular regiment was with them at the time. So be warned. In September 1813, Marshal Soult said they were killing French officers at a fast rate, and the losses of officers was totally out of proportion to the losses of ordinary soldiers, which was a kind of backhanded compliment, really. After John Moore's retreat to Corunna and the appalling conditions suffered by the troops, the Rifles, like any other regiments, needed replacements. 300 recruits were needed. Such was the stature of the regiment that over 1,000 men volunteered to serve. Although, in addition, there were recruiting parties, the Rifles obtained volunteers more easily than most other regiments. Matthew's service record is quite impressive, partly due to the fact he was in an elite regiment with good surviving records. And we know he was in the 1st Battalion of the Rifles in the 5th Company. Knowing this makes tracking Matthew much better, and in certain instances his company is highlighted, which merely gives you a feeling of you're getting to the real story. The Royal Green Jackets Museum in Winchester are extremely helpful. It's well worth a visit, and they will help research an individual for a small cost. All the details are on their website, and there's pamphlets at the back about the museum. Having previously served in the North York Militia, Matthews was an experienced soldier when he joined the Rifles, so he served as a chosen man and a corporal. He had 2 occasions he was off sick. Once he was in hospital at Elvash after the Battle of Busaco in September 1810, but we don't know if he was wounded or sick. And in June to August 1815, after Waterloo, he was absent again, unspecified whether he was sick or wounded. In total, his military service totaled 46 years and 1 month. 11 years, 2 months as a rifleman, 6 years, 1 month as a corporal, and 21 years, 3 months as a sergeant. And for that he got a pension which was enhanced by 2 years having served at Waterloo. From the army records, of which Sue will talk more later, we know he was 5'7" tall, he had grey hair, and hazel eyes and a fresh complexion, but that was in 1853, so he might have changed a bit. He was clean shaven, as that was a requirement, short hair. The Rifles paid a great deal of emphasis on bathing when they could, and shaving, and generally looking. Their uniforms might have been rubbish, but they were supposed to look clean in them. Matthew could almost certainly read and write. He was been agile and very fit, and a good ability to work with his comrades, and precise and accurate in his actions, and which may have been contributed to by his experiences of being a weaver. And we know he had initiative and self-reliance, and I am sure he was immensely proud of the 95th. After the American War of Independence, there was a new ethos, and it led to the first riflemen being founded in the North York Militia in 1795. In 1798, the 60th Royal American Rifles was founded. And then in January 1800, the Experimental Corps of Riflemen was formed by General Coote Manningham and Sir William Stewart. And in 1803, the 95th Regiment of Foot was formed, known to us all as the Rifles. In somewhat of a change, their officers were professional soldiers and did not generally buy their commissions. The social barriers in the Rifles between the men and the officers were lower, although not abolished, they were lower than in other regiments. Individuals were recognised as such. This was a big difference from the infantry, and were not just treated as a body of men. An eager rifleman showing potential will be invested in. If he couldn't read or write, then he would be taught to give him better chance of promotion, because if you were a sergeant or above, you had to be literate. This also incorporated new tactics and uniforms. The Rifles wore dark green with black belts and accoutrements to enable them to blend in better into the landscape. The uniforms were made of wool, very hot in summer and hard to dry when they got wet. And as they fought in both snow and rain, and also when fording rivers. Their jackets were short, so they allowed ease of movement. They wore what they called a stovepipe shako, again, for ease of movement. Shoes were not issued, and they were shoes as opposed to boots in the Rifles. They were not issued as left and right. They were dead straight, so many riflemen swapped them each day to get even wear. And gaiters were worn over the tops of the shoes and round the bottom of the trousers. They carried the Baker rifle and a sword bayonet. Unlike infantry regiments, they were allowed to trail arms, which consists of carrying the rifle by their side. They did not put them over their shoulders because that just caught on trees, bushes, or anything else. Officers used the bugle and the whistle to direct their men. Generally, riflemen were smaller and more agile, and they were bright and capable and encouraged to take independent action. They were schooled in the art of skirmishing and encouraged to push the enemy on their own initiative. They worked in pairs and they were trained to hit moving targets. They trained with live ammunition and they're trained to load on the move, to fire from any position and to use the landscape as their cover. They deliberately aimed their weapon. Infantry soldiers just pointed, as it was said in Sharp, in the general direction of the French. Their targets were enemy officers and NCOs. They marched at 140 paces a minute, unlike the infantry, which marched at 120. They skirmished in front of the army. They were its protective screen. They carried out picket duty and collected intelligence. The rifles carry no colours, and these days all their battle honours are worn on the cap badges. The rifle's cry was first in the field and last out of it. On campaign, they carried knapsacks and blankets, but during battle, those were all left behind wherever their headquarters were. And they only carried their weapons and sometimes water bottles, but not always. Their knapsacks contained everything they needed, and if you believe that or understand that most of them were away for 6 years, then they had a very small personal amount of baggage. They carried the trotter knapsack, which was a wooden frame within a black waterproof canvas pack that had leather straps. It was very uncomfortable, and the chest straps were so tight that it was hard to breathe. These were exchanged whenever possible for the more comfortable French packs made of soft leather. So you killed a Frenchman and you nicked his backpack. In addition to a spare linen shirt, stockings, trousers, the riflemen carried spare soles and heels for their shoes, brushes, wash kit, toothbrush, razors, strops, but that was about it. They also had what they called a bread bag, which was a canvas bag in which they would have their rations and their tea, most importantly. The rifles loved their tea. Their total weight of packs was between 70 and 80 pounds, and in addition, every squad of 8 men carried 4 bill hooks or felling axes, which they alternated around, so every other day they had an extra 6 pounds of weight. Each carried the Baker rifle, 46 inches long, which weighed just over 9 pounds, and they had a sword bayonet of 23 inches. Now, the rifles generally did not fix bayonets as you would expect the infantry to. The sword bayonets, which was like a mini sword, they used for practical purposes. They were good for putting meat on over the fire or for collecting brushwood or any of those sort of jobs. The musket was rifled with 7 grooves of a quarter turn, which gave its accuracy when compared to the Indian pattern musket. The musket rate was 55 inches long and fitted with a 17-inch bayonet, which made it quite unwieldy until you were experienced with it, and it weighed nearly 10 pounds. Both weapons were flintlocks, i.e. you had a flint and you loaded with black powder. The rifles tended to keep theirs of a dark colour and not to polish the brass, because that gave reflections. Whereas the musket was really only useful for volley fire at about 50 yards, the rifle was over 200 yards. when the rifles needed even greater accuracy, then the ball was wrapped with a leather patch, and they used fine black powder carried in a powder or flask, and this could increase both the accuracy and the distance of the shot. Weapons could foul when used repeatedly and had to be cleared with hot water. If this was not available, you pissed down the barrel. The weapons became red hot with continuous use, and which caused burns to the hands of the user, and the kick of the weapon would cause severe bruising to the shoulder. Riflemen carried 80 cartridges while the infantry 60. Now, the cartridges came in short packages with black powder at one end with the round shot at the top end, and they had to bite the ball away from the black powder and spit it down the barrel, and then having got the musket ball in the barrel, then you poured down the powder. So any soldier that lost his front teeth was dismissed from the army because they couldn't bite the cartridges. The firing rate of musket was up to 4 shots a minute, while the rifle, being much slower to load, was 1 to 2 shots a minute. For the first years of the war, the army retreated to safety in Portugal at regular intervals. They ventured into Spain, and then it looked as if they were running back, making for long and tedious marches. But Wellington had to protect not only his army, because it was half the size of the French, but his supply lines, hence the constant manoeuvring. I've estimated that Matthew marched over 4,000 miles during his time in the peninsula. And dependent on location, it would be scrubby, rough ground or mountains such as the Pyrenees, over which they had to fight at altitudes of over 4,000 feet. And the Pyrenees, the high peaks, are up to 12,000. Imagine doing that in absolutely freezing cold weather, being attacked by the French and still having to fight. Many areas that were chosen for the campsites, because of the need for water, were also swampy and resulted in high cases of fever. And in the early years of the Peninsular Campaign, Wellington's supply lines were totally inadequate, which left food in very short supply and fresh water hard to come by. When Matthew and his comrades landed in Lisbon in July 1809, must have been a totally alien environment to him and his comrades. Strange sights, countryside, different food, very hot, and later bitterly cold. Oh, and they spoke a different language. A number of troops were poisoned by the oleander. They did not realize that every part of the oleander plant is poisonous. They used the sticks to thread meat onto or food and got themselves poisoned, or they got it all over their hands and then ate. And this is just one of the hazards that they knew nothing about. They learned, but they didn't know. And within 3 weeks, Arthur Wellesley was fighting at the Battle of Talavera in July 1809. The Rifles marched 42 miles in 24 hours to get to Talavera, but despite their best efforts, they arrived after the Wellesley had won the battle. They would have been hot, dehydrated, as the water was in short supply, exhausted, and every inch of them would have been hurting from the rubbing equipment and the ill-fitting shoes. Their reward? They had to bury the dead and search out the wounded. The sights of the aftermath of this battle, and indeed all others in the peninsula, and afterwards Waterloo, would have been horrendous. Talavera, for many of the troops, was their first sight of the carnage of battle, and must have caused many to wonder how to cope with these sights. Unfortunately, the answer was often excess drinking. At Talavera, it would have been particularly bad because the artillery shells had set fire to the vegetation and many of the wounded had been burnt to death. The doctors did their best, but infection and disease were prime killers. Malaria was endemic in Spain and Portugal, and other diseases such as typhoid, dysentery and typhus took their toll. Food supplies, as I've said, were very variable. In August 1809, at the bridge at Almaraz, the rifles were reduced to eating dumplings made of pea flour, chopped straw and water. For the first couple of years, there were no tents issued to the rifles. If they were lucky, they got to sleep in a barn or a shed, but often in the open, even in winter, when their hair and heads were frozen to the ground. It was an extremely hard 5 years with little comforts, patch shoes and threadbare uniforms. But Wellington didn't care what his men looked like, as long as they fought. The records only seem to indicate that new uniforms and shoes were issued twice during this period. It seemed that whenever a difficult or dangerous job needed to be done, it was given to the 95th and or the Light Division. Because as the Army's protective screen, they were out in front of the rest of the Army. They were Wellington's eyes and ears on the frontier between Spain and Portugal. At this time in 1810, basically the French were in Spain and we were in Portugal. The countryside here was wild, rough and almost uninhabited, and the rifles spent many months here. But it suited them to be out on their own and away from the main army and headquarters staff. They were especially watching the bridges and the fords across the Agueda River at Barba del Puerco and at the River Coa. At Barba del Puerco, which means the beard of the pig, the river flows through a ravine, so the French were on one side and the British were on the other, watching each other. It was a miserable time to be on watch there, and rifles must have been constantly soaked through with heavy snow and rain. One night in March, the French attacked the British pickets, and there was a significant skirmish in which the rifles eventually routed the French attack, although the French had twice the number of troops. And if the French had succeeded in overrunning them, the way would have been open to attack the rest of the army. Wellington was pleased with the rifles' actions, and part of the divisional order states, the 95th Regiment has proved the rifle in the hands of a British soldier is a fully sufficient weapon to enable him to defeat the French in a close fight. And the work of the Light Division continued to increase as the French pushed forward, and they were constantly on the alert, which effectively meant being on underarms for days at a time with no rest. The Light Division advanced position were very vulnerable, and as they were attacked constantly by the French, and they made a fight and retreat to the River Coa, to the bridge there, forever known as Crawford's Bridge, and again demonstrated their skills and expertise in fighting the French. The thing that we think that the soldiers hated the most was sieges, which is demonstrated by the attacks and sieges of Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz. In 1812, the siege of Badajoz took place, and detachments from the Light Division, including the rifles, were detailed as working parties. They worked in wet, stormy conditions and were exposed to French sniping and artillery shells. They had to dig over 1,000 yards of trenches and parallels by hand. They detested such work, and the French attacked and stole their spades and entrenching tools. This was not work for real soldiers, was the general opinion. The rifles also had to provide pickets and any French soldier in the city, or more especially an officer that showed himself as a prime target. At night, they went into no man's land and dug pits, which they occupied, and sniped at the French during the day. Baderhof was protected by a ditch, glacis, and walls up to 30 feet high. The height of the walls was increased by the ditch and moat, which could be up to 10 feet deep. Once the siege guns had made a breach, the first storming parties went in, and they were known as the Forlorn Hope, as chances of survival were almost nil. And then they were followed by other troops, but at the top of the breach, the French would have fortified it with abattis, which were logs or barriers with sharp swords or spikes attached to, artillery, mines, and then the soldier. Some members of the Rifles did participate in the Forlorn Hope, but as elite troops, they were generally not permitted to do so. The storming of both Ciudad Rodrigo and Baderhof were carried out at night, which made everything more difficult and unpleasant. The carnage and horror of such operation superseded that of the battles in the open and were hated by most of the troops. The atrocious behaviour of the army on entering both cities cannot be excused, but it is somewhat understandable when the butchery of these sieges is considered. However, Wellington could be criticised for not controlling the raping and pillaging much sooner. In contrast, and the marching, when they set up camp for a few days, the riflemen would hope for a chance to rest, to repair their uniforms and equipment, and have a chance to maybe catch local wildlife or go fishing to supplement their diet. It's the thing that many people don't understand, that the armies only fought for a certain number of months of the year, and they would set up winter camp for up to 4 or 5 months, and it would be a semi-permanent establishment because you just can't fight and use artillery in winter. The officers would hunt with hounds, hold lavish dinners with the locals, preferably female, and explore the countryside. Officers and riflemen would drink and gamble. They'd have music, sing, write letters, and there were even such things as plays produced in winter camps. Some of the officers might be fortunate enough to have home leave or local furloughs. This didn't apply to enlisted men. And in contrast to the boredom of winter camp, they actually looked forward to getting back on the campaign trail. During the Christmas 1810, when the Rifles were in the village of Barba del Puerco, their commanding officer, Beckworth, obtained a pig. He had it covered in grease and released it in the village. Any rifleman who could catch the prize would have it for Christmas dinner. In 1814, the 1st Battalion were issued with new uniforms, and then they went into the battles of Orthez and Tarbes. And in April 1814, Wellington received notification that Napoleon has abdicated, and 4 days later, the army won its final battle at Toulouse. On the 13th of July 1814, the 1st Battalion embarked at Pauillac for the voyage home, and they disembarked at Portsmouth on the 22nd of July and marched to Dover. Furloughs were granted and the riflemen headed home to see their families. From Dover, it could have taken up for 2 weeks for Matthew to march back to Barnard Castle. Then the Rifles settled down for home duty at Shorncliffe Barracks near Folkestone. And in the spring of 1815, they were due to go to America, but this order was rescinded after Napoleon's escape from Elba. 2 months later, they were on their way to Belgium. A series of canal barges took them from Ostend to Ghent, and then they were reunited with Wellington, who reviewed the troops. 5 days later, they were in Brussels. And then they marched to Quatre Bras, where on the 16th of June 1815, fighting against the French resumed. This was a critical crossroads about 12 miles south of Waterloo, and the 1st Battalion were on the north side of the Namur Road. But during a hard day's fighting, to add insult to injury, there was a blue-on-blue incident. When the Duke of Brunswick's light infantry fired on them, the Brunswick's troops were recruit and they panicked, so they fired at anybody or anything that was in front of them. The 95th spent the night near Chemincourt Farm, south of the crossroads. They had been marching and fighting for 26 hours. They had no greatcoats and it rained all night. And on the following morning they marched north to Mont Saint-Jean, the correct name for the battle site, but Wellington decided that he wanted to name it after Waterloo, which was a few miles further north. Wellington knew the area from previous reconnoitring and chose the site to fight the French because of the ridge, behind which he could deploy his troops on the reverse slope to give them some protection until they were needed. The rifles were camped round the cottage of their commanding Colonel Barnard. There were soaking wet conditions in the night and meant that Napoleon didn't start the battle till late morning. A nervous time, no doubt. At the centre of the battlefield was La Haye Saint, and this is near where the rifles were. There was a sand pit on the opposite side of the road, and behind it a knoll with a hedge, and this is where Matthew was. The rifles fought there all day, and as the final attacks weren't launched until the evening, they had a long and hard day, and it was considered to be the severest fighting between the rifles and the French in the whole of the Peninsular War. And they started on the 9th of June back to Paris and became part of the Army of Occupation. In early 1816, the 95th Regiment of Foot was taken out of the line for its outstanding work and restyled the Rifle Brigade, which was a real honour and recognition of its tremendous service. But what of Matthew? Well, he survived Waterloo and then was in hospital and did whatever was wrong with him contribute him to leaving the army, because on the 25th of May 1816, now aged 29, he was discharged while still in France, presumably at his own request, and travelled back to England to the next stage of his life.
In terms of recognition of that service and that gallantry and that endurance, I think is probably the best word, Matthew received the Waterloo Medal, and the award of that medal was announced in the London Gazette on the 23rd of April 1816. And it was issued subsequently. People didn't have to apply for it. It was issued to all the men that had actually been there. It was the first medal to be awarded to all ranks, and it was the first medal to be awarded to the next of kin of men who were killed in action. It was the first also to have the recipient's rank, name and regiment inscribed around the edges. The men were also credited with 2 years extra service and pay to count for seniority and pension purposes, which was probably the most attractive element of the recognition. But it did not sit well with the veterans of the Peninsula, who had served and endured a period of years of fighting rather than a few days. And it is said that while they were in the occupation of Paris, some of the veterans of the Peninsula would rip off the Waterloo Medal off any young, newly arrived person wearing it because they felt that it was ill-deserved. The Peninsula men would have to wait and wait and wait for 30 years for recognition. And not surprisingly, during that time, many of them who'd served had died. And that medal which is known as the Military General Service Medal, but also more commonly known as the Peninsula, but it did cover other campaigns as well between 1793 and 1814. There were a potential 29 clasps for that medal in terms of it. The most awarded to any one man was 15. Matthew qualified for 7. But unlike the Waterloo Medal, there was no service or pension benefit for these men who'd fought for so many years. They only awarded it to surviving claimants. The next of kin were not allowed to apply for it on their relatives' or ancestors' behalf. And there was very limited publicity for it. So in fact, there were only just over 25,500 applicants, a fraction of the men who'd actually served in the Peninsula. The 95th Foot Rifles received a total of 691 medals, and one man of the Rifles received 14 clasps. But Matthew did return home, and to be fair, these days we would talk about the after effects of an experience like the Peninsula and its effect on mental health. Obviously in those times there wasn't that. I'm not entirely sure that the veteran soldiers of Waterloo or the Peninsula were particularly admired or respected by the people when they returned. I don't think they necessarily got a very good welcome back. So he did return to Barnard Castle. He went back to live in Startforth on the right side of the River Tees, where he was still in sight of Barnard Castle. He married, he had a child of his own, and would live to see his grandchildren born. But Barnard Castle had changed, and he probably didn't recognise it very much. A published history of Barnard Castle describes the first half of the 19th century as the dark days of the town. The number of factories had increased, weaving had moved its product to carpets rather than clothing, and just increasingly the rates of pay, the conditions and the state of the town, with its smell from the tannery works and the noise, was probably not a very nice place to live. But it had also changed in respect of his family, because they dispersed, because the Napoleonic Wars didn't just affect those men who fought, it affected everybody at home as well. And many had moved away, so there was a much smaller population of Swalwells in Barnard Castle at the end of the Napoleonic Wars than there were in the 18th century. Many had moved to new textile centres, so they'd gone to Lancashire, they'd gone to West Yorkshire. Some probably moved because of relationships they'd formed during their time, and married and made new relationships, such as Anthony Swalwell, who ended up marrying a Glasgow lass, and he'd been stationed there. Other members of his family had served during that time in the militia, but their experience of war would have been very different. It may be that it was the dispersal of his family that made him rejoin the North York Militia on the 24th of June 1823. He had returned perhaps to his new normality of camaraderie, structure, lifestyle of a regiment and a familiar looking uniform. He was back with his other family. But he also rejoined his family members too, because both his half-brother George and his brother William were already in the militia. What exactly the men of the 1851 centres, the 3 sergeants were all in their 60s in the North York Militia, were doing is quite difficult to work out, because actually during that time and after Waterloo the militia had been reducing gradually and annual training was becoming less frequent. And it feels like they were not necessarily particularly respected in terms of it, but one of the things we do know that they did was actually they marched out to elections. One of the nice things about the annual accounts of the regiment is they also have lots of receipts, such as this certificate about marching out. They also have receipts for things like 4,000 loaves that they needed to feed the men. My favourite quote of all is from 1834, when these sergeants and the militia was inspected. And the colonel described it as, "The Sergeant Major, George Swalwell, 53 years old, appears zealous but deficient in the principles of drill. There's one drum major who is no drummer, which seemed a disadvantage to me, but anyway, appeared old, debilitated and worn out. The 8 drummers were on the whole competent and the sergeants generally well qualified, but one was too corpulent and another too sickly, which I hope wasn't Matthew, because actually I've always imagined him as Sean Bean, so that was a bit disappointing. Within the notes, there are also lots of record mentions about all these sergeants being sent to Chelsea Hospital, and that's indeed where Matthew went. And I'm going to rattle through this very quickly, but I've got examples of the records at the back, so I can explain it to you later. He was a Chelsea outpencher. He was not a red-coated in-pencher, which is what we associate Chelsea with today. He couldn't be an in-pencher because he was married, and that was prohibited. But I'm sure he didn't particularly want to live in London. And there was only accommodation for about 500 people at Chelsea, whereas there were tens of thousands of outpensioners all around the world and in England. And the system of Chelsea pension social welfare system is just phenomenal. I recommend you to read up about it. In the notes that I'll send round, there is a great paper on it, which I would recommend. Basically, it's a great resource for family historians. You get the physical description. Not only do we know about Matthew, but I also know that there's a grey-eyed trait in the Swalwells of Barnard Castle. It gives you a really detailed summary of their military service, and that is really helpful. And it means that you can also track somebody because they were paying it. So if they moved, they changed where they were paying it through, and they had an amazing system of agents around the country and abroad who got the money to the men. So he stayed, so he became a Chelsea pensioner. He moved to Herworth, which was actually his final resting place. His was a much quieter departure from this life than that of Captain Sir John Kincaid, who got lots of coverage in the newspapers about his death. There was just a very simple announcement in the local paper that Matthew had died. And it mentioned nothing about his military service, and so we have no idea to what extent he was one of those soldiers who came home and didn't talk about it, or to what extent his family knew it. But what we hope is that we think his story has largely been forgotten, and the members of his descendants that we've talked to, none of them have been aware of his story so far. So we hope we've done what the actual Mr. Purder and his social comedians promised, that their names would live on forevermore. So we've hoped we've done a bit about that. And there is no memorial stone. There's no gravestone to him in Herworth Church. So our next project is to try and see if we can persuade somebody to allow us to put one up so that his memory lives on. And thank you, and I'm very sorry for running over. But we are around all day, so if we don't get to do many questions now, just come and ask.
Sorry. Thanks very much, Sue and Marilyn. That's, I think, is a great start to our day, looking at various aspects of the military. As Sue said, her and Marilyn will be here all day. I'd rather not take any questions now so that we can keep to schedule. But by all means, speak to them over the lunch break or tea break this afternoon if you've got any specific questions. And as I say, Marilyn's got a great display over there, and Sue's got this great display, so do take an opportunity to look at that. So we've got a quick 4 minutes comfort break whilst we just change speakers. So we will try to restart. I mean, that clock is a little bit fast according to my eyes.